November 29th, 1981. Catalina Island, California. Somewhere in the dark water off the coast, America's sweetheart was gone. She had been afraid of dark water her entire life. She had told people, repeated it in interviews, said it plainly. She loved being near the water, near it, but never in it. And now, she was in it. Back in their home on the mainland, two little girls were asleep. One was 11, one was 7. Neither knew yet that their world was about to end. This is the story of what happened to those two girls and what the loss of their mother made of their lives. The woman they lost. To understand what Natalie Wood's death cost her daughters, you have to understand who she was. Not the film star, not the magazine cover, but the woman they knew as their mother. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938, in San Francisco, California, the daughter of Russian immigrants who had fled Europe with almost nothing and rebuilt their lives in America. Her father, Nikolai, was a carpenter. Her mother, Maria, was a woman of fierce ambition and, by multiple accounts, a willingness to use any available means to pursue it. When a fortune teller told Maria that she would give birth to an exquisite little girl who would become a famous movie star, Maria received it not as a flattering prediction, but as a plan to execute. The caveat that the same prophecy described this beautiful child's life ending in a drowning in dark water was not kept from the girl who would carry it. Maria passed the fear along, folded it into Natalie from childhood, and it became one of the deepest and most consistent facts of her interior life. She was terrified of water. Specifically, deeply, she was afraid of dark water. She wouldn't enter her own swimming pool. She gave interviews for decades in which she described the fear plainly. Near the water, yes. In the water, no. Only weeks before her death, she had told a journalist that she was afraid of water that was dark. The fear had never left her, not in 43 years. The fear had roots beyond the prophecy. When Natalie was 10 years old, filming a scene in The Green Promise that required her to cross a bridge over turbulent water, the bridge was rigged to collapse at a predetermined moment. Her mother told her it was perfectly safe. When Natalie reached the midpoint, the bridge collapsed and she was thrown into the river, clinging desperately to the wreckage. She was pulled out, physically unharmed, but the experience was its own kind of scar on top of the one the prophecy had already made. From that point, the fear deepened into something closer to a phobia. Nightmares about drowning, an inability to be near moving water without anxiety, a reluctance so severe she had to fight it on film sets when directors required water scenes. Bette Davis once threatened to leave a production rather than allow a director to force the young Natalie to swim to a raft, defending the child actress when the director would not listen. Her film career began before she could read. She made her debut at 4 in a bit part in a 1943 film, then starred at 6 alongside Orson Welles and Claudette Colbert in Tomorrow is Forever. At 9, she played Susan Walker, the sensible, skeptical little girl in Miracle on 34th Street, and delivered a performance of such naturalness that audiences felt they were watching a child think in real time. By the time she was 18, she had already been nominated 3 times for an Academy Award. She was the rare thing, a child star who became an adult star without the awkward, grinding transition that claimed most of her contemporaries. Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, Splendor in the Grass in 1961, West Side Story also in 1961, Gypsy in 1962. Film after film, decade after decade, she was present and luminous and entirely real on screen, in a way that the camera can't manufacture. She was one of Hollywood's most consistently admired actresses from the time she was a child until well into her 40s, and she earned every moment of it through genuine work rather than manufactured celebrity. But her childhood had been shaped by forces that left damage alongside the stardom. Her mother, Maria, was a stage mother of the most extreme variety. She had pushed Natalie relentlessly from the age of 4, controlled her environment and her relationships, and according to various accounts, had made choices about how to advance Natalie's career that no responsible parent should have made. The biography of Natalie Wood, researched across more than 400 interviews by Suzanne Finstad, describes a childhood in which accomplishment and trauma were inseparable, and in which Maria's ambition was the organizing principle of the family's entire existence. She was also, by the accounts of everyone who knew her privately, the same person off-screen as she appeared on it. Warm, funny, genuinely interested in people, an extravagant celebrator of every holiday and birthday and occasion that she could find an excuse to mark. She filled her home with flowers. She told Russian fairy tales at bedtime. She made Easter and Christmas and Halloween into productions of love and attention. Her daughters have spoken about their childhood with a particular tenderness, describing the feeling of a home filled with light and affection, a mother who made every moment feel chosen. She was the center of something. When she left, the center did not hold. Two little girls and a changed world. Natasha Gregson was born on September 29, 1970, the daughter of Natalie and her second husband, British film producer Richard Gregson. The marriage had seemed promising. Gregson was intelligent, accomplished, and devoted, but it did not survive. They separated when Natasha was 10 months old and divorced in 1972. Richard Gregson remained in his daughter's life and maintained a relationship with her throughout, but the daily reality of her upbringing was shaped by what came next. What came next was Natalie's reunion with Robert Wagner. Wagner, known to almost everyone in their lives as R.J., had been Natalie's first husband. They had married in 1957, when both were young and beautiful, and Hollywood's favorite romantic pairing. That marriage had ended in 1962, damaged by various pressures. They had both gone on to live their lives, and then, after careers that took them through the 1960s and other relationships, they found their way back to each other in the early 1970s. They remarried in 1972, and the second version of their marriage was, by most contemporary accounts, warmer and more grounded than the first. Natalie described the relationship, in a 1974 interview, as having left the storms behind. Smooth sailing this time around. Courtney Brooke Wagner was born on March 9, 1974. She was the daughter of both Natalie and Robert, the only child they shared. The family that assembled in the 1970s included Natasha, whom Wagner legally adopted so she could take his name, Courtney, the biological child of both, and Katie Wagner, Robert's daughter from his second marriage to actress Marion Marshall. 3 girls with different biological configurations, all raised together in the same house in California, with a mother who threw herself into the role of parent with the same energy and commitment she brought to everything else. The home in the 1970s was, by the accounts of multiple people who knew the family, genuinely happy. Natalie had chosen to step back from the relentless pace of her earlier career in order to be more present for her children. She was deliberate about it. She took on work that didn't require extended time away, gave interviews in which she described the domestic life as what she had always actually wanted, and shaped her days around the rhythms of a household with young children rather than the demands of a major star's schedule. Photographs from this period show a family at ease. Birthday parties with absurdly elaborate decorations, beach days, holiday celebrations. Natalie surrounded by her daughters, with the expression of someone who has found exactly what she wanted. Natasha and Courtney remembered the house as full of warmth and humour, and a sense that the family was the main event, not the career. They described their mother as funny, fierce, physically affectionate, and completely present when she was with them. Natasha recalled a mother who gave hugs freely and made every ordinary day feel like it contained something worth noticing, who celebrated Easter and Christmas and Halloween to the maximum, who read bedtime stories with genuine dramatic engagement, who made the children feel like the most important thing in the room. Then, in the late 1970s, Natalie returned more actively to her career. She appeared in a television film called Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1976 and began taking on more ambitious projects. By 1979, she was cast alongside Christopher Walken in Brainstorm, a science fiction film directed by Douglas Trumbull. It was a significant production, and Natalie threw herself into it with a seriousness that suggested she was enjoying the challenge of being fully back in the professional world. She was also preparing for what would have been her stage debut, a development that those who knew her best described as genuinely exciting for her. She also remained, throughout this period, afraid of water. It never left her. And in November 1981, the yacht and the dark water and everything that followed was still ahead. The night at Catalina. Thanksgiving weekend, 1981. Natalie and Robert Wagner, accompanied by Christopher Walken, her co-star on Brainstorm, took their 60-foot motor yacht, the Splendor, out to Catalina Island for the holiday weekend. A fourth person was aboard, Dennis Davon, the yacht's captain, who had worked for the Wagners for years. The events of the night of November 28th into the early hours of November 29th have been disputed, re-examined, and reclassified by law enforcement more than once in the decades since. What is established, there was significant drinking that evening. At some point during the night, a confrontation occurred. Its precise nature and severity have been described differently by different participants. Robert Wagner, in his 2008 memoir, described breaking a wine bottle on the table during an argument with Walken that he characterized as a dispute about Natalie's career. Captain Davon's account, given in his own 2010 book and in subsequent interviews, described a more serious altercation between Natalie and Wagner and alleged that Wagner delayed calling for help after Natalie disappeared. What is documented by the forensic record? Natalie Wood was found floating in the water near the island at approximately 7:45 in the morning on November 29th. She was wearing a red down jacket, a jacket that, waterlogged, would have weighed her down considerably, and a nightgown. There were bruises on her body. She was 43 years old. The coroner's initial ruling was accidental drowning. However, the manner of death was later changed to undetermined by the Los Angeles County coroner following the reopening of the investigation in 2011, citing the bruising patterns that were inconsistent with a simple accidental fall into the water. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the investigation. In 2018, detectives named Robert Wagner as a person of interest, not a suspect, but the person they believed had the most information about what had happened that night. Wagner has consistently denied any involvement in his wife's death and has declined to cooperate further with investigators. He has stated publicly that he did not harm Natalie. The case has never been closed, has never been solved, and no charges have ever been filed in connection with her death. On the morning of November 29, 1981, Robert Wagner came home to his 3 daughters and told them that their mother was not coming back. Natasha was 11, Courtney was 7. Natasha. Growing up in 2 worlds. Natasha Gregson, who used the name Natasha Gregson Wagner after her stepfather formally adopted her, was the older of the two daughters, and in many ways, she was the one who carried the weight of consciousness more directly. She was 11 when her mother died, old enough to understand what death meant, old enough to have memories that were complete and detailed, old enough already to have been defined partly by who her mother was. She has spoken in multiple interviews and in her 2020 memoir, More Than Love, an intimate portrait of my mother, Natalie Wood, about the quality of that morning in November 1981. She described waking to the news as a kind of collapse, the world going from color to black and white, the sound cutting out. The phrase she returned to was that her entire world was shattered. She had been, she said, always gripped by a fear that something would happen to her mother. The fear had been with her for years before it was realized, a child's intuition that something precious was precarious. When the thing she feared came true, the grief was not just grief for the present, but for all the future she had already spent quietly dreading. The years that followed were, by her own account, years of living as a shadow of herself. She was raised by Robert Wagner, who took on the full-time responsibility of parenting all three girls after Natalie's death. Richard Gregson, Natasha's biological father, remained present and involved. And Natasha has described herself as having grown up with two fathers rather than one. Robert, who was her daily parent, and with whom she developed a bond she described as deeper than it would have been had Natalie lived, and Richard, who was a presence in her life even as geography and circumstance limited the frequency of their contact. She attended Crossroads School in Santa Monica, then went to Emerson College, then transferred to the University of Southern California. In 1992, she left USC to pursue an acting career, a decision that was simultaneously the most natural thing in the world and the most complicated, given who her mother had been. The acting career that followed was one shaped significantly by independence rather than the family name's commercial leverage. Natasha appeared in films that were largely independent, edgy, and characterized by roles that had nothing to do with the image her mother had projected. She appeared in Wes Craven's thriller Mind Ripper in 1995. She had a role in David Lynch's Lost Highway in 1997. She co-starred with James Woods, Melanie Griffith, and Vincent Kartheiser in Larry Clark's crime drama Another Day in Paradise in 1998. A performance in a genuinely challenging film that demonstrated she was operating in a very different register from the classic Hollywood stardom her mother had inhabited. She appeared in High Fidelity in 2000 alongside John Cusack. She was not trying to be her mother. She was trying to be something else entirely, something with enough distance from the legend that she could call it her own. There was something deliberate in that. Natalie Wood had been so thoroughly identified with a certain kind of Hollywood beauty and polish and emotional accessibility that anything Natasha did in the same stylistic register would have invited a comparison that could only diminish her. By going toward the opposite, the darker material, the independent productions, the directors who operated outside the mainstream, she created space for her own identity even as the shadow of her mother's name followed her everywhere. She has spoken candidly about how her mother's death shaped her relationship patterns as a young adult. The pull toward older men with established identities, the difficulty of trust, the particular vulnerability of someone who had lost her primary anchor at 11 years old. Her relationship with Josh Evans, the son of director Robert Evans and actress Ali McGraw, lasted from 1990 to 1997. She later married screenwriter D.V. DeVincentis, the co-writer of High Fidelity, in October 2003. They divorced in January 2008. She found greater stability with actor Barry Watson, whom she married in May 2012. Their daughter, Clover, born that same month, became the only grandchild of Natalie Wood. The moment Clover arrived, something shifted for Natasha that she has described with considerable emotion in various interviews. She became, for the first time, the mother. She was in the position her mother had occupied. She was the one responsible for being the center of someone else's world, and she found it both profoundly meaningful and profoundly difficult, because the template she had for motherhood was a woman she had lost when she was 11, and the grief of that loss was suddenly right next to the joy of the new beginning. She understood, looking at her daughter, something about what her mother had felt looking at her. The continuity across that gap was both beautiful and painful in ways that are hard to articulate. In 2020, the HBO documentary Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, which Natasha co-produced, arrived as the culmination of decades of private reckoning made public. She had spent years wanting to reclaim her mother's story from the narrative of the death, which had dominated it for nearly 4 decades. She wanted people to remember who Natalie Wood was, not just how she died. The documentary was her effort to do exactly that, to put the woman, the mother, the actress, the human being back at the center of a story that had been reduced to a mystery and a set of unanswered questions. She also published her memoir, More Than Love, that same year. A book that drew on her mother's journals and home movies and her own memories to offer the fullest portrait yet of the woman behind the star. She has said the experience of making both was healing rather than painful. The home movies, her mother's journals, the voices of people who had loved Natalie when she was alive and whose memories were of the living woman, not the unsolved case. Natasha described the work as putting right something that had been wrong for a long time, restoring the full person to a story that had been flattened into a single terrible night. Courtney, the one who was 7. Courtney Brooke Wagner was 7 years old when her mother died. That sentence contains the essential fact of her story. 7 years old. At 7, you are old enough to know something irreversible has happened. You are old enough to feel the absence in the physical world, the empty chair, the voice that doesn't come, the bedtime routine that stops. You are not old enough to carry the understanding forward in a continuous way, to have the memories be coherent and accessible. What you have, instead, are fragments, the warmth of a feeling, the shape of a person, the sensation of being loved by someone specific, and then the silence where all of that used to be. Courtney recalled waking on the morning of November 29th to the sound of her sister screaming. She recalled the house full of adults who had arrived suddenly, the presence of a nanny who stayed close to her side, her father coming to her and telling her she was not going to see her mother again. She recalled trying to make sense of it, the way a 7-year-old makes sense of things, which is to hold the facts and wait for them to become real, and then wait some more when they don't. From as far back as she could remember, she said in the 2020 documentary, her family had been happy. She could remember the feeling of love and happiness in the air. The love and happiness was real. The people who described Natalie Wood as a mother were describing someone who made home feel like a destination rather than just a location. And then it was gone, and Courtney was 7, and the rest of her life began in that absence. She grew up under Robert Wagner's care alongside Natasha and Katie, raised in California with the specific burden of being not only a motherless child, but the motherless child of a famous dead woman. Every year, every anniversary of the death, the story circulated again. The questions about that night on the Splendor, the disputes about what had happened, the tabloid speculation, the books and documentaries and investigations that kept returning to November 29th, 1981. and treating it as the central event of a story that, for Courtney, was also the story of her own life. She spoke in interviews years later about how the grief had been something she didn't know how to process in any healthy way, and so had not processed. She had numbed it. She had found things that made the pain quieter, made the noise in her head less constant, made the absence of her mother something she could function around rather than something she had to look directly at. This pattern, common in people who lose a parent young, particularly under traumatic or unresolved circumstances, had real consequences for her in adulthood. In 2012, Courtney Wagner was 38 years old when police were called to her home in Malibu following a report of screaming and a gunshot. When officers arrived, no one had been injured. The man with her was arrested for a firearms charge. Courtney herself was found to be in possession of cocaine and heroin and was arrested on suspicion of felony drug possession. She posted a $10,000 bail and was released. The arrest made the news with a particular cruelty. The headlines connected her name to her mother's, as they always did, and the story of Natalie Wood's daughter arrested for drug possession was treated by the press as a piece of celebrity gossip, rather than as what it actually was, a 40-year grief arriving at its bill. Courtney spoke about it publicly in 2012 with a candor that was both difficult and clearly necessary for her. She described the label that had been put on her, the sense that she had defamed her mother's name, the shame of that. She said she had been so upset at the idea of being her mother's so-called junkie daughter that she had used that shame as fuel to try to find a different way. She said she had to look at how she could make things better, not just for herself, but in some sense for her mother, to honor the person she had been, rather than add to the painful public narrative surrounding her death. The grief behind the drug use, and this was stated clearly by those close to the family, was inseparably connected to the loss of her mother. When Courtney was 7, something was taken from her that could not be replaced. The years had shown that she could not simply not grieve it and be fine. The grief would find its expression one way or another. She found her way to sobriety. Natasha described her sister, in the 2020 People interviews connected to the documentary, as someone who lives in the truth, someone whose recovery demands total honesty. She described Courtney as having arrived at a place of real compassion for herself, a forgiveness for the years when she didn't know how to carry what she'd been given. Courtney also, in the same period, found creative purpose. She founded a jewelry company, channeling something of her mother's love of beautiful things into a business that was genuinely hers. She spoke at events connected to the documentary. She participated in telling her family's story in her own voice, rather than having it told about her by people who knew less. She has been clear, publicly and repeatedly, about her fury at the speculation surrounding her father, Robert Wagner. The renewed investigations, the naming of Wagner as a person of interest, the annual recycling of theories about that night. Courtney has described experiencing these as attacks on her family that compound rather than resolve anything. She has said that certain people continue to keep the speculation alive for their own purposes, with no regard for what it costs the people living inside the story. She stands by her father. She has said plainly that she knows him, and that the person she knows is incapable of having harmed her mother. Whether that belief is correct is something the investigation has not resolved and may never resolve. What is certain is the cost, the real, measurable, human cost. To a little girl who was 7 on the morning of November 29th, 1981, and who has been carrying that morning ever since. What the loss made of them. The two daughters of Natalie Wood are, as of this writing, both alive and both in their 50s. Natasha is in her mid-50s. Courtney is in her early 50s. They have built lives. They have their own relationships, their own work, their own ways of being in the world. The trajectory from the two little girls of November 1981 to the women they became is not a simple or clean arc, but it is, in both cases, one that moved eventually towards something real and sustainable. What the loss made of them is not simply damage, though the damage was real and lasting. It also made them the two people best positioned to tell the world who Natalie Wood was. Not the tabloid subject, not the unsolved mystery, but the woman who told Russian fairy tales at bedtime and celebrated every holiday to maximum excess and gave hugs that her daughters remembered decades later as one of the defining physical sensations of their childhoods. Natasha produced the documentary. She wrote the memoir. She sat with her mother's journals and her mother's home movies and assembled the pieces of a portrait that was always the full human being rather than the Hollywood legend or the drowning victim. She was also, in the process of doing all of this, completing a grief that had been interrupted and redirected and managed but never fully resolved, doing it at 50 for the 11-year-old who had never quite had the chance to do it properly. This was her particular form of grief work, the long, patient project of making sure her mother was not permanently reduced to a mystery. She also became, by the evidence of her own interviews and writing, someone whose life had been given a particular quality of attention and presence by the loss, someone who understood, because she had learned it the hardest way possible, that the people you love can be gone without warning, and that the time you have with them is not infinite. Her daughter Clover is being raised by a mother who carries that knowledge. Courtney found her way to sobriety and to an honesty about her own story that required considerable courage. She spoke openly about the grief and what it had cost her when most people in her position would have stayed silent or deflected. She described, in the 2020 documentary, the specific texture of growing up with a famous dead mother, the peculiar grief of having strangers feel a proprietary connection to your loss, of having the anniversary of the worst day of your life show up annually in tabloid coverage and true crime podcasts and casual jokes on television shows. She described hearing a comment on a program about a pool party at Natalie Wood's house and finding it incomprehensible that someone could find that amusing. She also said something in that documentary that landed as the simplest and most true thing any of them had said about the whole story. She said that her father and her sisters experienced a true tragedy together, that they were each traumatized, but that they had each other, and that having each other had made living bearable. Not easy, not healed, bearable. That word, bearable, carries more weight than its 3 syllables suggest. It is not the language of triumph or recovery or resolution. It is the language of people who have understood something real about grief, that it does not end, that it becomes, over time, something you carry differently rather than something that disappears. Bearable. Still here. Still carrying it. Still each other's. The family that had been assembled in the 1970s. Robert Wagner raising 3 girls through grief. Katie standing beside her younger sisters, Natasha and Courtney, holding to each other across the specificity of their different losses, had held together in ways that are genuinely unusual for families that sustain this kind of blow. The loss had not broken them apart. It had made the bond between them into something that could not be undone. Their bond is stronger than any kind of glue, Katie said. She had been beside them from the very beginning of the worst chapter and had stayed there for decades. The questions that remain. 44 years after Natalie Wood's body was found floating in the water off Catalina Island, the investigation remains officially open and officially unresolved. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department has continued to describe Robert Wagner as a person of interest. Wagner has not been charged with any crime. He has not cooperated with investigators since the case was reopened in 2011. He has maintained, consistently, that he does not know what happened to his wife and that he did not harm her. Dennis Davon, the yacht's captain, gave an account in his 2010 book that differed significantly from Wagner's and alleged that Wagner had delayed calling for help after Natalie disappeared. Wagner's account, given in his 2008 memoir published before the case was reopened, described waking to find Natalie gone and the dinghy missing, initially assuming she had gone ashore. The bruising found on Natalie's body at the time of her discovery remains unexplained. The cause of death as recorded on her death certificate is drowning. The manner of death was changed from accidental to undetermined in 2012, following the Los Angeles County Coroner's re-examination of the evidence. Christopher Walken has never publicly spoken in detail about what happened that night. He gave brief comments to the press in the immediate aftermath of Natalie's death, expressing his shock and grief. He has not participated in any subsequent investigation or documentary. The dinghy, the one that was missing when Wagner first went looking for Natalie, was found adrift near the island. It showed signs of having been tied and then untied, or possibly retied in a different location. Nothing definitively conclusive was established about how or when Natalie had come to be in the water. What is known, and what has never been in dispute, is that Natalie Wood had a profound, documented, lifelong terror of dark water. She had spoken of it in interviews. Her friends and family confirmed it. Her sister, Lana Wood, in interviews given after the case was reopened, said that the idea of Natalie voluntarily entering the dark water of the Pacific Ocean at night, alone, in a red down jacket and a nightgown, in November, made no sense to anyone who knew her. The jacket she was found wearing would have become enormously heavy when wet, almost immediately compromising her ability to stay above water. For Natasha and Courtney, the unresolved nature of the investigation is not abstract. It is the continuing reality of not knowing, with any certainty, what the last hours of their mother's life looked like. It is the recurring public presence of a story that has been cycling through the media for 4 decades and that they have to encounter regularly in public spaces and casual conversations. It is the specific and wearing experience of being the children of a famous unresolved case. Natasha has made her position clear in multiple interviews. She wants the speculation to end. She wants people to remember her mother as who she was, the actress, the mother, the woman, not as a mystery to be solved by amateur investigators on the internet. She produced the documentary specifically to put that version of the story forward, to offer something that was about Natalie Wood, the human being, rather than Natalie Wood, the cold case. She has said she believes the tragedy is that her sister and she lost their mother, that Robert Wagner lost his wife, and that the world lost a beloved actress. That is the tragedy. That is what she wants the conversation to be about. Courtney has expressed similar exhaustion with the cycles of speculation and a more pointed anger at the specific people who, in her view, continue to keep the accusations circulating for their own benefit. She has defended her father with a directness that has made some observers uncomfortable, but that is entirely consistent with the perspective of someone who grew up with the man, knows him as a parent, and cannot reconcile the father she knows with the person being described in the worst versions of the investigation narrative. None of this resolves anything. The case is open. The manner of death is undetermined. The truth of what happened on the Splendor on the night of November 28, 1981, may never be established to any standard that satisfies the legal system or the public. What has been established, in the years since, is something that the investigation cannot touch. The two daughters who woke on the morning of November 29th to discover their mother was gone have lived full and honest lives. They have faced what they had to face. They have built what they could build. And they have kept their mother present. In interviews, in a memoir, in a documentary, in the stories they tell, in the laughter they describe, and the Russian fairy tales they remember. The woman who was afraid of dark water all her life, who carried a prophecy inside her from childhood and lived alongside it for 43 years, is gone. But the daughters she gave her love to are still here. They are still carrying her in the ways that matter, in the warmth of how they describe her, in the work Natasha has done to restore her as a full human being, in the honesty Courtney has brought to her own story. In Clover, the only grandchild, who has grown up knowing that her grandmother was Natalie Wood, and knowing, because her mother made sure of it, that this meant something more than fame. Natasha said in the documentary that since her mother's death, there has been so much focus on how she died that it has overshadowed who she was as a person. That was what she wanted to change. That was what the memoir and the documentary were for. The tragedy is that her sister and she lost their mother, she said, that their father lost his wife, that the world lost their beloved actress. That is the tragedy, not the mystery, not the investigation, not the decades of speculation. The tragedy is the mother who was loved by two little girls and is gone from the world at 43 on a November night, in the dark water she had been afraid of since before she could read. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. 3 women, 19 husbands between them, a cop-slapping incident that ended in jail, a mother who charged her own daughters 2 cents for a hug, millions lost to Bernie Madoff, a prince who may or may not have been a real prince, and a legacy so outrageous that historians of American celebrity still can't quite agree on what to do with it. Before the Kardashians, before Paris Hilton, before anyone had invented the phrase famous for being famous, there were the Gabors. This is their story. The mother who manufactured legends. To understand the Gabor sisters, you first have to understand Jolie Gabor, because without Jolie, there are no Gabors. There is just a middle-class Hungarian family from Budapest that history would have ignored entirely. Jolie was born Jankiska Tillemann around 1896 in Budapest, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She was clever, beautiful, and possessed of an ambition that outran the circumstances she had been handed. She had dreamed of becoming an actress. When her parents sent her to a Swiss finishing school, and then arranged her marriage to a businessman named Vilmos Gabor, who was roughly twice her age, and whose family name had been changed from the Jewish-sounding Grun to the more assimilated Gabor, specifically to ease their passage through an increasingly anti-Semitic Hungarian society. Jolie asked for a divorce within 6 months. She did not get one. She discovered she was pregnant, the divorce was postponed, and the marriage endured for another 22 years, producing 3 daughters: Magda in 1915, Shahza in 1917, and Eva in 1919. Jolie ran a jewelry boutique in Budapest. She was not a warm mother in the conventional sense. She has been described, including by her own daughters, as a woman who charged them 2 cents for a hug and who pit the sisters against each other as a matter of management strategy. She wanted them perfect, competitive, and attractive to powerful men, because those were the qualities she had decided would get them out of whatever ordinary life might otherwise have been their fate. She sent them to private schools. She had them tutored in languages. She made sure they could carry themselves in any room they walked into, that they spoke with grace, that they could dance. that they understood the social mathematics of mixing with wealthy people without appearing desperate. The Gabor family had converted from Judaism to Catholicism in 1928, a decision driven by the practical calculation that Hungary's growing anti-Semitism made Jewish identity a liability. The conversion didn't protect them from everything that was coming, but it bought time and navigating room that would prove important. What Jolie was building, essentially, was a brand. The Gabor girls were to be a product that she had designed and that the world would want. In this she was, by any honest reckoning, extraordinarily successful. She was also, by most accounts, a difficult person to have as a mother, and the particular combination of ambition and emotional unavailability she brought to parenting left marks on all three of her daughters that the diamonds and the husbands and the television appearances never fully covered over. Zaza would later say that Jolie had been a complicated woman to grow up with, that she was funny and sharp and totally focused. But that warmth was not her primary offering. The 2 cents for a hug was not simply a family joke. It was a description of an emotional economy that all three daughters had grown up navigating. The first to leave Budapest was the youngest, Eva, who married an American osteopath named Eric Drimmer in 1937 at the age of 18 and moved to the United States with him. Then Zaza, who had already married a Turkish diplomat and made a name for herself in Vienna. Then, eventually, the family chaos of World War II would accelerate everything. The war and the escape. By the early 1940s, the Gabor family was scattered across 3 countries and a gathering storm. Eva had arrived in the United States in 1939, ahead of her sisters, having moved there with her first husband, Eric Drimmer. She was signed by Paramount Pictures, took acting lessons, and made her first American film, Forced Landing, in 1941. She was the first of the sisters to build something in America, and she did it largely alone, without Jolie beside her and without the accumulated social momentum that the 3 sisters would develop when they were finally together. Zsa had been in Vienna, where at around the age of 17 she had been discovered by the famous operatic tenor Richard Tauber, who invited her to perform in his new operetta at the Theater an der Wien. She had attended acting school in Vienna, had won the Miss Hungary beauty pageant in either 1935 or 1936. The stories about the year shifted depending on which account you consulted and how old Zaza was comfortable admitting to, and had subsequently been disqualified from the pageant records when it emerged she had misrepresented her age. She had then, in a gesture entirely characteristic of who she was, proposed to Burhan Asaf Belg, a 35-year-old Turkish intellectual and government official, married him in 1937 and spent several years in Ankara before the marriage deteriorated and she made her way toward America in 1941. During a layover at an airport in Omaha, Nebraska, on her way to Hollywood, she made headlines by casually mentioning to an Associated Press reporter that she had once danced with Adolf Hitler twice at a Vienna party. The comment was reported worldwide. She had been in America for approximately 48 hours. Magda, the oldest, had stayed in Hungary longer and had become entangled in something far more dangerous. She had taken a position as secretary at the Portuguese embassy in Budapest, working for the ambassador, Carlos Sampaio Garrido. She had also, by this point, become his lover. More significantly, she had been involved in anti-Nazi resistance activities for several years, work that, if discovered, would have carried severe consequences. She was also helping Garrido in a wider humanitarian operation, using his diplomatic status to issue passports and papers to Jewish Hungarians who needed them, an effort that ultimately helped save the lives of nearly 1,000 people. Garrido has since been recognized by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Research Institution in Israel, as one of the righteous among the nations for this work. When the Nazis occupied Hungary in 1944, Magda, her mother Jolie, and her father Vilmos were all arrested. The family had converted to Catholicism, but that was not sufficient protection against a regime that defined Jewish identity by ancestry rather than practice. The Portuguese ambassador's connections and his willingness to use them intervened and secured their release. The three of them eventually made it to Portugal and then to the United States, where they rejoined Eva and separately Zaza. The reunion of the family in America, specifically in New York and then in Hollywood, was the beginning of something genuinely new. Merv Griffin later described what it was like when the Gabor sisters arrived on the American social scene. He wrote that all these years later, it was hard to describe the phenomenon of the three glamorous Gabor girls and their ubiquitous mother. They burst onto the society pages and into the gossip columns so suddenly and with such force, it was as if they'd been dropped out of the sky. That description is not an exaggeration. The Gabors arrived in post-war America with something that the entertainment industry and the social establishment of the era were not entirely prepared for. Three strikingly beautiful, impeccably dressed women with thick Hungarian accents, a talent for witty conversation, and an attitude toward wealth and marriage that treated both as both a game and a serious pursuit. They called everyone darling. They wore jewelry that was larger than anyone else's. They showed up at the right parties and then made those parties more interesting by the simple fact of being there. They were also, quite deliberately, keeping Jolie's vision alive. The brand she had built in Budapest was now being rolled out on the most visible stage available. Zsa Zsa, the middle sister and the center of everything. Of the three sisters, Zsa became the most famous, not primarily because of any film role or stage performance, but because of a personality that was simply impossible to look away from, and because of a series of marriages that became the running comedic narrative of her public life. She had married Conrad Hilton in 1942. She was 25. He was 55, and the founder of what was already a significant hotel empire. He was also, by Zsa's own account, a deeply controlling man who tried immediately after the wedding to change her name from Zsa to Georgia, a gesture she later described in her autobiography as an attempt to erase her Hungarian identity and replace it with something more manageable. She resisted. She wore jewelry he hadn't given her. She refused to become what he wanted her to be, and the marriage deteriorated through jealousy, control, and incompatibility before ending in divorce in 1947. Their daughter, Francesca Hilton, was born in 1947. She would go on to spend much of her adult life in a complicated and sometimes painful relationship with the Hilton family's wealth and with both of her parents' fame. Francesca died in January 2015 at the age of 67, leaving Zsa, then 97 years old and in poor health, without her only child. During the marriage to Hilton, Zsa's mental health had become a serious concern. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, then described in different terminology, and in 1945, Hilton had her institutionalized against her will. This episode, which was both traumatic and telling about the marriage's power dynamics, was something she spoke about relatively rarely in public. The version of Zsa that the world got to see was the confident, arch, self-deprecating performer who made jokes about her marriages with perfect comic timing. The person who had been committed against her will, while her husband held the legal authority to make that decision, was someone she kept largely off-screen. After Hilton came George Sanders, the British actor known for his sophisticated, sardonic screen presence. They married in 1949 and remained married until 1954. Sanders was, by most accounts, genuinely fond of Zaza and she of him, but the marriage was too volatile to hold together over the long term. What happened after the divorce was one of the more spectacularly strange footnotes in the entire Gabor story. Sanders, after divorcing Zaza, went on to marry her sister Magda. The marriage lasted 1 month. Most observers assumed it was either a revenge gesture against Zaza, an act of residual longing for the marriage he had just ended, or some combination of both. Sanders himself, characteristically, said very little about it that could be taken at face value. The husbands continued to accumulate after Sanders. Herbert Huttner, a financier whom Zaza described in her autobiography as having nearly destroyed her ambition through excessive kindness and generosity. She wrote that his thoughtfulness almost annihilated her drive, that she had always been the kind of woman who needed excitement and achievement, rather than simply being taken care of. Joshua Cosden Jr., an oil tycoon from a Texas family. Jack Ryan, an inventor best known for creating the Barbie doll and developing various military hardware for the US government. A combination of resume entries that was genuinely unusual. Michael O'Hara, a Beverly Hills attorney. Felipe de Alba, a Mexican actor whose marriage to Zazia lasted exactly 1 day before it was annulled. It emerged almost immediately after the ceremony that Zazia was still technically married to Michael O'Hara, making the wedding to de Alba legally void from its first moment. That episode, the 1-day marriage, captured something essential about the Gabor story. It was farcical. It was also, in its way, entirely characteristic of a life that had been arranged so relentlessly around the performance of romance that the actual logistics of that romance sometimes became secondary. Each marriage produced press coverage. Each divorce produced more. Zijadzia's approach to discussing her marriages in public was one of the genuinely original contributions she made to American celebrity culture. She talked about them with a combination of self-deprecation, genuine humor, and just enough bitterness to keep things interesting. She remarked that she was a great housekeeper because every time she got a divorce, she kept the house. She observed that a man in love was incomplete until he was married, and then he was finished. She believed in large families, she noted, and thought every woman should have at least 3 husbands. She treated the whole romantic catastrophe of her life as material, and the material was excellent. The 1989 incident, when the persona became the story. For most of Zaza's career, the distinction between the real woman and the persona she had constructed was clear enough that the persona could operate freely. She was Zaza Gabor, a performance as much as a person. And audiences understood they were watching a highly skilled entertainer play a version of herself that was about 30% more outrageous than the truth. In the summer of 1989, the two collapsed into each other in spectacular fashion. On June 14th, 1989, Ziaza was driving her Rolls-Royce Corniche convertible through Beverly Hills when a police officer named Paul Kramer pulled her over for expired license plates. What happened next became one of the most widely reported celebrity incidents of its era. When Kramer approached the car, Zaza did not simply accept the citation. She challenged him. When the interaction escalated to the point where Kramer asked her to step out of the vehicle, she drove away. He pulled her over again. When he attempted to remove her from the car, she struck him. She was arrested on the spot. The trial that followed was, by any standard, a circus, and Zaza, whether by design or by sheer force of personality, was its ringmaster. A Zaza Gabor impersonator appeared at the courthouse. A man wearing a T-shirt with an anti-Zaza message got into a fight with the impersonator outside. The judge presiding over the case accused her directly of treating the proceedings as a publicity opportunity and described her behavior as a mockery of the justice system. The district attorney of Los Angeles County criticized the entire spectacle. She was convicted. The sentence was 3 days in jail, fines and restitution totaling $12,937, 120 hours of community service, and a psychiatric evaluation. This last element was its own kind of irony, given that she had been institutionalized against her will 44 years earlier. She served the 3 days in jail between July 27th and July 30th, 1990. She refused to complete the community service. She went to jail with her typical composure and came out in the same condition. She subsequently appeared in The Naked Gun 2.5, a Fresh Prince of Bel-Air episode, and a film version of The Beverly Hillbillies, all as essentially herself, all explicitly trading on the notoriety of the arrest. The incident had, in a strange way, given her a second career moment. She was 72 years old, and she had managed to make a traffic stop into a national conversation. The last husband arrived in 1986, when Zaza was 69. Frederick Prince von Anhalt was a German-American who had acquired his noble title through an adult adoption by Princess Marie Auguste of Anhalt, a process that some royal genealogists found unusual and others found irregular. He was roughly 30 years younger than Zaza. Their marriage, which technically made her a princess with a title, lasted until her death in 2016, making him, by a considerable margin, her longest-serving husband. During the marriage, he ran unsuccessfully as a candidate for governor of California and for mayor of Los Angeles. He also briefly and improbably claimed to possibly be the father of Anna Nicole Smith's child, a claim that, like much else surrounding him, did not survive close examination. Zaza's final years were defined by accumulated physical misfortune. A car accident in 2002 left her frail and in a wheelchair. A stroke in 2005 further diminished her. A fall in 2010 broke her hip. In 2011, her right leg was amputated below the knee following a severe infection, and she spent her final years on life support, unable to communicate. She died on December 18, 2016, at the age of 99, at Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, 50 days short of her 100th birthday. Her ashes were eventually reinterred in Budapest in 2021 at Kerepesi Cemetery, fulfilling a wish she had expressed to return to Hungary. She had been famous for 70 years. Eva, the sister who actually could act. Of the 3 Gabor sisters, Eva was the one who most consistently used the platform the family name provided for actual performance work, and whose career arc, when examined honestly, is more interesting than the marriage's narrative usually allows. She had arrived in the United States in 1939, ahead of her sisters, and was picked up by Paramount Pictures, which gave her acting lessons and cast her in her first American film, Forced Landing, in 1941. Through the 1940s and early 1950s, she worked steadily in films and on Broadway. She appeared in the original Broadway production of The Happy Time in 1950 alongside Claude Dauphin, in a run that demonstrated she had genuine range and was capable of holding her own on stage alongside accomplished theatrical performers. Her first significant film role in an American major production came in 1954 in The Last Time I Saw Paris, alongside Elizabeth Taylor and Van Johnson. Critics noticed her. She was not playing the Gabor persona. She was doing actual acting in a real dramatic story and holding her own in the presence of one of the most charismatic stars of her generation. But the role that defined her career, and that gave her a permanent place in American popular culture, arrived in 1965 when she was cast as Lisa Douglas in Green Acres, a CBS sitcom about a glamorous New York socialite reluctantly transplanted to rural life on a farm with her husband, played by Eddie Albert. The premise was essentially a comedy of contrasts. Lisa Douglas, with her French cooking, her chiffon gowns, and her unshakable conviction that she was the most civilized person in any room, against the actual roosters and pig farmers of Hooterville, where nothing worked the way it was supposed to, and the only person who seemed to truly understand the telephone was the local operator. Eva was perfect in it. She played Lisa Douglas with a combination of genuine comedy timing, physical expressiveness, and a willingness to be fully, gloriously absurd in service of a joke. Something that went well beyond simply being beautiful with an accent. The role required her to do things that a vainer performer would have quietly declined. She had to be the butt of jokes. She had to cook terrible food with complete serene confidence. She had to react to situations that defied logic with a cheerful inability to notice they were illogical. She did all of it without apparent hesitation, and the result was a character that American audiences loved with a warmth that exceeded what the show probably deserved on paper. Green Acres ran for 6 seasons until 1971, and its reruns have never entirely stopped. She reprised Lisa Douglas in crossover episodes of The Beverly Hillbillies and Petticoat Junction, and the character became the role most people thought of when her name came up, which was, all things considered, a considerable achievement for a woman who had spent years trying to be taken seriously as a dramatic actress. She had also, by most credible accounts, built a genuine business. She founded a line of wigs and hair products that became commercially successful, a venture she developed and managed with real acumen rather than simply putting her name on someone else's operation. The business added a dimension to her public identity that was more than decorative, and it provided financial independence that did not depend on the current state of any marriage. Eva's marriages were 5 in number and considerably less dramatic in their public dimensions than Zsa Zsa's 9. She had married Dr. Eric Drimmer, the osteopath who had brought her to America in 1937. That ended in divorce, as did marriages to wealthy socialite Charles Isaacs, actor John Williams, and real estate developer Richard Brown. Her 5th and final marriage was to businessman Frank Jameson, whom she married in 1973. They remained together until 1983, when they divorced. Eva never remarried after Jameson. She spent the last years of her life in a close friendship with Merv Griffin, the television host and entertainment mogul who had known the Gabber family since their early Hollywood years. Griffin was gay, and the relationship between him and Eva was one of genuine affection and practical mutual support rather than romance. She lived near him, spent considerable time with him, and the two of them moved in the same social world without the complications that romantic involvement would have added. Griffin later wrote about her with evident warmth, describing her as one of the most genuinely amusing people he had known, and someone whose friendship had enriched his life in ways he was not always sure she fully understood. In the final period of her life, she found in that friendship something stable and uncomplicated that most of her previous decades had not provided. She died on July 4th, 1995, in Los Angeles. She was 76 years old. The cause was pneumonia following complications from hip replacement surgery that had become necessary after a car struck her on the street outside a building. The complications were serious, and she did not recover. Her death came first among the sisters, and it devastated both Magda and Zsa Zsa, and their mother, Jolie, who was told the news so gently and so incompletely that she apparently never fully understood what had happened. Jolie died in April 1997, at roughly the age of 100, still not fully knowing that her youngest daughter was gone. The information had simply been too painful to deliver to a woman that old, and so it was withheld, and she departed from the world without the grief that the truth would have brought. Magda, the sister the world forgot. If Eva was the one who could act, and Zsa was the one who became the performance, Magda was the one the public largely forgot, which is, in its own way, one of the more interesting things about the Gabor story. She was the oldest of the three, born in 1915, and by most accounts the most practically capable. She had survived the Nazi occupation of Hungary through a combination of intelligence, political involvement, and the protection of a lover with diplomatic immunity. She had helped save lives, her own and many others, through the operation connected to the Portuguese embassy. She had crossed the Atlantic and rebuilt her life in an entirely new country in middle age. She had done all of this without the film contracts and the television roles and the tabloid coverage that sustained her sister's public profiles. She appeared in one Hungarian film before the war, and in a handful of American television appearances in the 1950s. She was not an actress in any serious professional sense. What she was, instead, was a skilled social operator, someone who understood how to cultivate connections, build networks, and make things happen for the family through practical rather than spectacular means. In 1953, it was Magda who negotiated the contract for the entire Gabor family, Jolie, Magda, Zsa, and Eva, to perform together at the Last Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas. The show, called This Is Our Life, ran as direct competition to Marlene Dietrich, who was at that point the top nightclub act in Las Vegas. The Gabors held their own. Eva later described the show as horrible, but audiences disagreed, and the engagement was a commercial success that only Magda's business instincts had made possible. She had married 6 times. Her husbands included an American businessman, a Hungarian nobleman, and George Sanders. But also, in her later marriages, a man named Tibor Heltai, with whom she spent what appears to have been her most settled period of partnership. None of the marriages lasted indefinitely, but Magda accumulated them with rather less fanfare than Zsa and considerably more dignity than most of the tabloid coverage of the family suggested was possible. She also had the most macabre footnote in the sisters' marriage history. After George Sanders divorced Zsa in 1954, he married Magda. The marriage lasted 1 month and was annulled. Nobody ever entirely explained what Sanders had been thinking. The most generous interpretation is that he missed Zsa, and this was the closest he could get to her. The least generous interpretation is that it was an act of deliberate provocation directed at a woman who had ended their marriage. Sanders himself died in 1972, leaving behind a note that described his feelings about the world with characteristic bleak clarity. He was bored of it, he said, and had lived long enough. It was the kind of exit line that would have impressed even Zsa. Magda's later life was quieter than her sister's. She suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed, which ended her mobility and curtailed her social life significantly. She spent her final years in Rancho Mirage, California, near her mother Jolie, managing declining health with a pragmatism that had always been her defining quality. She died on June 6, 1997, 5 days before her 82nd birthday, and just 2 months after Jolie. The timing of the 2 deaths within such a short span was its own kind of melancholy footnote. By the time Magda died, Eva was already 2 years gone. The 3 sisters, and the mother who had invented them, had all departed within the space of 2 years. The money, the title, and the things that didn't hold. The Gabor story is, among other things, a story about money. specifically about the gap between the impression of wealth and the actual accounting of it. The sisters had arrived in America, presenting themselves as scions of European aristocracy, which was not entirely accurate. They were the daughters of a Budapest businessman who had changed his name to avoid anti-Semitic discrimination, and a jewelry shop owner who had channeled her thwarted ambitions into her children. They were not poor by any reasonable measure of early to mid-20th century Hungarian bourgeois life, but they were not the titled nobility that their affect suggested. They spoke of Hungarian high society with the authority of people who had been born to it, while the reality was that Jolie had used it as a model rather than a birthright. The daughters absorbed the style and the language of aristocracy and reproduced it so convincingly that the distinction between the real thing and the performance became, for most practical purposes, irrelevant. The accents were real. The jewels were real, though financed variously by marriages, divorces, appearances, book deals, and, in Zaza's case, the shrewd management of her own celebrity as a commercial asset. The lifestyle was real in the sense that they actually lived it, as long as the money from the current husband or the current contract held out. What was less real was the underlying structure of genuine intergenerational wealth that the performance implied. Zisazia, who was the most extravagant and the most visible, was also the most financially exposed as she aged. In 2007, it emerged that she had lost approximately $7 million through Bernard Madoff's investment fraud, one of the largest financial schemes in American history. She acknowledged it publicly, noting that the loss had left her unable to pay approximately $118,000 she owed to the IRS. A woman who had once been photographed in enough diamonds to ransom a small country was being chased by a tax bill in an amount that was, by the standards she had spent her life projecting, genuinely modest. It was an undignified situation, but she addressed it with the same dry humor she had brought to everything else. The noble title that her final husband brought was also subject to questions that became louder over time. Frederick Prince von Anhalt had acquired the Prince designation through an adult adoption arrangement with an elderly German princess, a process that was legal in Germany, but that royal genealogists and historians considered a somewhat unconventional route to aristocratic status. The title made Ziza, technically, a princess with the designation of the Duchy of Saxony, something she took considerable and unapologetic pleasure in. But the more carefully one looked at the genealogy, the less straightforward the lineage appeared to be. Von Anhalt himself seemed unbothered by the scrutiny, and Zaza seemed even less bothered. Eva's business success with her wig and beauty line was real and substantial, but the financial comfort of the Green Acres era did not survive entirely into her final years. Magda's financial situation was further reduced by the medical costs of her final years and the circumstances of her partial paralysis. What the Gabors had was the performance of wealth, and they had it at a level so consistent and so sustained that for most of their public lives, the performance and the reality were functionally indistinguishable. It was only in the final accounting, when the marriages had ended and the television appearances had stopped and the dust settled, that the gap between what they had seemed to have and what they actually possessed became visible. The legacy of the Gabors. Television host and producer Merv Griffin, who knew the Gabors better than most, and who watched their arc from Budapest bombshells to American cultural fixtures to elderly women in declining health, once described them as people who had been dropped out of the sky into American celebrity. He meant it as a compliment, and it was accurate in ways he may not have fully intended. What the Gabors actually invented, or perhaps more precisely, what Jolie invented and her daughters executed with extraordinary consistency, was the template for the celebrity that exists outside of any particular skill or achievement. They were famous because they were glamorous, and because they were entertaining, and because they said things that were quotable, and because they were always, somehow, in the room where things were happening. The acting was real, particularly for Eva. The personality was genuine, if also constructed. The marriages were a constant source of material. And the accent, the diamonds, the darling, those were the costume that made the character immediately legible from across any room, at any party, in any decade. They appeared on talk shows for 40 years. They guest starred on every major television program that wanted a reliable injection of glamour and wit. They were photographed with kings and politicians and movie stars. They were quoted in newspapers and gossip columns consistently from the early 1950s through the late 1980s. They adapted their material constantly. When the films dried up, they did television. When the television opportunities narrowed, they did talk shows and cameos. And when even those became rarer, they simply continued being themselves in public, which had always been their most reliable act. Film historian Neil Gabler, in 1998, coined the term the Zsa factor to describe a specific kind of celebrity that exists independent of any quantifiable talent. Famous for being famous, which is to say, famous for the performance of fame itself. The description was not intended as a compliment, but it captured something real. Zsa was the template. The Kardashians, Paris Hilton, Anna Nicole Smith. These are the lineage, whether they acknowledge it or not, and whether Zsa's former publicist found the comparison offensive or not. But the Gabor story is also, genuinely, a story about women who survived things that the glamour narrative tends to obscure entirely. Magda survived the Nazi occupation of Hungary through courage, strategic thinking, and considerable personal risk, and was involved in saving the lives of nearly 1,000 people in circumstances where exposure would have cost her own. Zsa survived being institutionalized against her will by a husband who held the legal power to make that decision, and then spent decades not discussing it, channeling the experience nowhere except perhaps into the particular edge that her humor about men always carried. Eva survived the loss of a first love, built a career on stages and screens that required real work and real skill, and then watched her health deteriorate through events she had no control over, with a composure that the people around her found remarkable. All three of them survived the particular form of social pressure that demanded they be objects of desire and entertainment without ever quite acknowledging the full range of what they actually were. And they survived it by making the performance so complete, so thoroughly embraced, so consistently delivered, that the world largely accepted their terms for decades. They were not victims. They were not helpless. They were three women with a significant talent for self-presentation who deployed that talent in an era when self-presentation was becoming a profession in its own right, and who got further on it than almost anyone who came after them. The last of them, Zsa, died in 2016, barely short of a century old. By that point, her ashes sat in a gold box at a cemetery in Westwood, California, waiting to be moved to Budapest. Waiting, in other words, to go home. The America that had received her in 1941 as a divorced Hungarian beauty queen with an accent and a determination to make something of herself had given her more than she had perhaps had any right to expect. She had given it back in full measure. The Gabors are gone now. All of them. Magda, Eva, Zsa and Jolie, the woman who had started it all in a Budapest jewelry shop with a plan for her daughters and an ambition that had nowhere else to go. They left behind a body of work and a body of chaos that is, in its own way, as complete a picture of a certain kind of 20th century life as anything else in the American cultural record. They had 19 husbands among them. They had an accent nobody else has ever quite replicated. They had a word, darling, that they made into a brand, a philosophy, and a farewell all at once. And they were dropped out of the sky, and they landed, and the ground was never quite the same. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.